Okay, welcome. Welcome back. So this is a kind of opportunity to reflect and discuss generally any topics that you wish. We thought that I'd just begin by briefly giving some feedback from the discussion groups from earlier. And then there's a question which Joel wants to put to the audience. So we met over lunchtime to discuss what had taken place in the rooms in which we ran through those questions. And I sensed that each of us had a sort of particular loyalty to our own room and our own themes. So I'm going to try to distill the ones that I think were common to each of the groups. And I hope I'm not too biased towards my own room. I'm sure my colleagues will tell me if that was the case. So the first question had to do with how you had discovered that you were a bit different. How did you discover that your imagery was more or less vivid? And there was reasonable consensus on this, so a number of people had discovered by, probably the majority I suspect, had discovered by coming across an account of the research on this topic. So reading something on the BBC, New Scientist, Blake Ross's post. So that was one prominent mode of discovery. But then there were others who'd always known or known for a very long time, and they often recollected that this had first come to light when they were having a conversation with someone close to them who either had vivid, if they were aphantasic, someone who had average imagery or vivid imagery, and they realized that that other person was recollecting in a rather different way, seemed to be having an experience that was somewhat visual when they were recollecting, whereas this was not the case for the person with aphantasia. So discovery through encounters with the story on the media, conversation with others. Then there were people who had made the discovery when they were invited to visualize in the course of a meditation mindfulness exercise or hypnotic induction or some other, an art class, some other context in which visualization was being encouraged. There were a few people who had abruptly become aphantasic as the result of an event. And then finally, there were some people who kind of knew it was a possibility because it was in the family, which intrigued me because there does seem to be a familial link here. So that was the first question. And then the second and third questions had to do with advantages and disadvantages. And there were a couple of advantages which were shared between people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia. And one was that people seemed to quite like belonging to a community. So it's nice to discover that there are other people like you. And there was also a sense that becoming aware of the fact that your imagery vividness is a little different makes you more aware of difference generally, and therefore perhaps more interested in or tolerant to the differences between people, both visible and invisible ones. So those benefits were shared between the groups. And then there were some pros and cons which differed between folk with aphantasia and hyperphantasia. So one set relate to memory. So in general, I think people with aphantasia, it's by no means true of everyone, but broadly, people with aphantasia feel that it's a little more difficult for them to recollect episodes richly than is the case for people with hyperphantasia. So there is perhaps a disadvantage. And of course, there's the disadvantage that if you're aphantasic, it's difficult for you to remember what the faces of your loved ones looks like, which can be a cause for regret, particularly after a bereavement. But on the other hand, you're likely to be less plagued by memories of things you don't want to remember. So there is a compensatory advantage. There was quite a lot of discussion of whether the difficulty in remembering the past in some folk with aphantasia might impact the ability to plan for the future. And that's been a big theme in memory research over recent years, quite close links between recollecting the past and anticipating the future. And so that came up. I don't know that there was a clear consensus about whether that was the case, and it was certainly suggested as something that would be interesting to investigate in future. So memory was one topic, and then the other topic had to do with, I guess, what one might call presentness. So a sense that people with aphantasia have slightly quieter minds and are perhaps better at being in the here and now, whereas those with hyperphantasia are more likely to be distracted by thoughts of the past and anticipations of the future. So perhaps benefit on the aphantasic side there. So I think those were the main common themes. There were plenty of other things that were discussed. And then the fourth question had to do with what you would like researchers to know about imagery extremes, and what you would like to see investigated in the future. So one area of interest had to do with whether other modalities than vision are affected. So aphantasia was defined in terms of the absence of visual imagery, but what about auditory imagery, or the mind's fingertip, or the mind's tongue? So it'd be interesting to learn more about other modalities of imagery. And I think in several groups there was also mention of this interesting distinction between spatial imagery and object imagery. So quite a lot of people with aphantasia seem to have a rather good, not true of everybody, but quite a lot have a rather good spatial sense. Perhaps the sense that enables folk with aphantasia to answer those questions about how many windows there are in your house or apartment, even though you can't see it. So an interesting distinction to be explored there. And along related lines, there was interest in synesthesia and its association with hyperphantasia. So there does seem to be a link between having very vivid imagery and the merging of the senses. I've had one or two interesting conversations with people in this group who've talked about where the future is. So, tomorrow's there, next Wednesday's here. That's where they are. Well, it's very that's a very synesthetic trait. It's not like that for everyone. So if you have a number line, that's probably pointing towards some tendency to synesthesia. So the first theme was imagery and other modalities. Then there was a number of people thought that it would be interesting to investigate memory further. Why is it perhaps that people with aphantasia are often very good at remembering facts, not so good at remembering episodes? How do these variations in memory relate to variations in foresight? There was interest in explaining better what it's like to visualize. Picturing things, what does that mean? That's something we've discussed in several talks so far, and there was some interest in genetics. So is this really do these traits really run in families? If they do, is there a biological basis, a genetic basis? A question for the future. So I think those were the main themes that emerged from our discussion groups, and Joel had a question that he wanted to ask.
Yes. So I wanted to test it or ask you guys a situational scenario. So let's imagine we have a training regime that could give you imagery, or if you're have very, very strong imagery, we could reduce that imagery. Now the question would be, would you do that? But with a caveat. We don't know whether it's reversible or not. So I'll say it again. So let's say you don't have imagery now, but we do this thing, and then you'll have imagery. Once you have it, you can't go back. How many of you, put up your hand if you'd say yes to taking part in such a study or using such a thing or product? So these are people with aphantasia who would be happy to have imagery, even though we couldn't undo that.
Yeah, would it be just from now, or would you get the imagery from the past as well?
You would have imagery as a tool that you could use to change your experience of your past when you remember things. Yeah.
Thank you.
So sorry. So what? So hands up, yes, if you would. Hands up, no, you wouldn't, but you still have. Ooh, so what's that? Looks like 50-50.
Close to 50-50, isn't it? Yeah.
And how about people with very strong imagery, hyperphantasia? Who's that in the room? How many? If you don't mind. And would any of you want to have your imagery reduced? If we could do that? No, you wouldn't. No one? Yes, one?
I'm going to ask you. Can I ask you two favours? Can you ask the same question again in the hypothetical that you knew how to switch it off?
Yeah.
Which you right.
Let's suppose you did.
So let's say so the same question then. Yeah. So we can give you imagery, and then if you don't like it, we can go back again. Who would choose to try it? Was there still anyone who doesn't want to try it, or wouldn't want to try it? Okay. So it's 2 or 3 or 4 people. Okay. That's it.
Can I ask you one more question?
Yes, one more.
If you switched it on,
yes.
What is your confidence that you would affect people's actual episodic recall as opposed to the experience of it? Would you switch on episodic memory, or would you just change the experience of it if it was already there?
I think it would be we don't know, but I would predict that it would be the way you experience those memories, not the memories themselves.
In other words, would you expect SDAM to be affected in any way?
In some way, but I wouldn't want to commit to in what ways in any detail.
Switched on the visual memory, our brains would have to then learn all the multiple different ways that we could use it, and they'd be wiring for the rest of our lives.
Sorry, John, but are you talking about visual memory or are you talking about imaging?
Here I'm talking about imagery, precisely. Sensory simulation, visual, different. Yeah. What's the plan now, Adam? We're going to keep going?
Matthew's taking over.
Could you introduce 2 new members of the
Yes, I'm sorry, we should indeed. So we're very lucky to have Emily Holmes with us, who is going to give a talk tomorrow about imagery and emotion.
In the breakfast slot.
In the breakfast slot, yes, so I'm sorry, it's a 9 a.m. Sunday start. Tomorrow. Somebody else I should introduce?
John?
John, oh yes, John. Everybody knows John. John's going to be speaking later this afternoon, indeed next. So John is the art historian member of our team, Professor of Art History at the University of East Anglia, and the world's first neuro art historian, I think it's fair to say.
So we're going to try and do some open questions. If you'd like a microphone, sort of try and let me know. Otherwise, I'll try and repeat your question if it's a bit quiet. Otherwise, I'll try and get through as much as we can. I think there's one hand that's gone up already.
Can I just say something really briefly? I've lost my phone. So if anyone spotted a phone anywhere in the vicinity, it's lost.
There's one starting off over there.
I wanted to ask a question about the registration process. So that, the imagery, how is it registering at the very beginning to ensure that it goes in and that it can carry on? So what if there's a deficit in the actual registration process of what you see?
In people with aphantasia.
You mean the visual perception, the way you...
Yeah, so if you can't hold an image, like I can't hold an image but it's just gone, how long have you got for that to imprint and start processing?
So I guess that's something we kind of touched on, isn't it? That there are several different kinds of memory. Iconic memory, which operates over...
It's visual persistence, iconic memory, up to about a second, and you move into... So there's a smear there, but you move into then working memory.
Working memory, which is when you're holding visual information in your mind, trying to keep it active while you work with it.
Start from that first point, isn't it? So, I'm thinking about along the pathway, if it's right at the beginning.
Yeah. So I think one really interesting question about aphantasia is how long is it possible to hold on to an image if you're aphantasic? And that's a question that I've wanted to investigate further. I don't know whether Joel has a feel for...
Could everybody speak up, do you think, please? Yeah, absolutely. You already use the microphone. That might be the idea.
So yeah, I apologise. So the question is... Interesting question. If you're aphantasic, you don't have visual images, but you see the world normally, by and large. So if you just close your eyes for a fraction of a second, can you hold on to an image? If okay, sort of shaking heads. Interesting. So this is an area for investigation. I think how long, if at all, do images persist? And so how are the various forms of imagery which Joel just mentioned affected visual persistence? Iconic memory, working memory, and then longer-term visual memory. Do you want to add?
So I showed some data yesterday that the performance in visual working memory tasks was, just looking at performance, was fairly indistinguishable between people with imagery and people without. We have some other published data looking at iconic memory and correlating that to imagery strength. We don't see a correlation there, whereas we do see a correlation between imagery strength and visual working memory.
So what iconic memory is?
So iconic memory is this sort of high resolution, high capacity memory that's sort of there up to about just before a second, and that's gone very quickly. And so it's different from visual persistence. So if you look up, if you look at me or the lights and close your eyes, you'll see some sort of after image, and there's an after image persistence. So that's not what I'm talking about. Iconic memory is different. It's sort of an access to this full capacity of what you're experiencing that goes very quickly up to a second. And then as you move to beyond a second, give or take, you need to start actively rehearsing and storing that information. That's working memory. So with the iconic, we don't see so far a relationship with imagery, but with working memory, we do. As I talked about yesterday, it seems that if you have imagery, you'll tend to use that as a mnemonic tool to help storage. But over these very shorter periods of memory, there's just not time to use imagery as that kind of rehearsal mechanism. That doesn't really answer the question. Is visual perception somehow subtly different in people with aphantasia?
So I guess it's kind of tempting to think that something must be going wrong with memory, but it doesn't have to be that way. It could be that visual information is stored, it just can't be retrieved in a particular sort of way. So there was a woman, I was facilitating a group this morning, and there was a woman who spoke about the fact that she couldn't create an image of a person in her head, but she could draw the person. So if you can do that, thought is, well, there must be memory for visual things there. It's just that it can't be retrieved in the form of having a visual image. But there's lots to be, there's lots to be thought about and investigated more there in general about whether certain types of memory are laid down and not others and so on.
Stemming from Joel's question, I'm curious as to, for those who have aphantasia and would choose the option to have the transition to having visual memory, how many people are curious and how many people think that having visual memory is better? Because I'm curious, but I think there's been a feeling that I've gotten from other people that they feel like they're missing out on something that they would choose to opt for. And so I'm curious what that division is amongst the people who have chosen to opt for that potential without a reversal.
So the question is, if you put your hands up if you're curious, and if you put your hands up if you think it's going to improve your memory.
Improve my life.
So I think you've got some you've got some overlap, haven't you?
50-50 again with the rationale one.
But with some overlap. Yep.
The risk of being a pain, the question was not about memory.
No, that's the wrong question. That's why I
What was
agree.
Joel's question?
Was that not your question?
That was his question.
That was his question.
No, Joel's question to
Yeah.
the audience was not about memory.
But this question was about whether having imagery might enhance memory.
No, not memory.
Life. Okay. Life.
A subjective assessment of whether or not it would be better to have visual memory or not.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right. So I'm wondering what that.
So should we? I'm sorry. So let's ask that again. How many are curious? Just curious. And how many feel it would make your life better? So, more curious, but a certain number feel it would make life better, and there's limited overlap between the two.
How many people would say it makes your life worse?
A few.
There's a lady down. Sorry. There's a lady down with a question.
Thank you. It's clear that there's going to be lots and lots of research on aphantasia and hyperphantasia in years to come. I'm wondering, are there research areas perhaps not to do with the mind's eye where you think people with aphantasia might be used like as a baseline or things in completely different areas?
Yes. Anyone else want to jump in, or do you?
No.
Oh, you're pointing. Okay.
So the way to answer that question that comes to my mind first is that we know that people with imagery will use it. So it's another way to think about that is if certain activities or tasks could maybe benefit from a simulation, a sensory simulation, a visual simulation, then there's probably a role for imagery in that task. So you could think about eyewitness memory literature and how that could be informed by people with hyper or aphantasia. So there's some evidence that people with strong imagery have worse eyewitness memory, for example. So that's a field there which I think is understudied, and we don't know enough about the role of imagery and memory consolidation and reconsolidation there, for example.
Can I ask Emily what she thought with? You must have some use for people with aphantasia and aphantasia.
Well, I was thinking, is this working? Yeah. I was just following on from Joel's comment, because I guess it can go both ways, because there's another whole literature on called imagination inflation, which shows that sometimes if you imagine things, every time you do, you distort that a little bit. And then you imagine it again, you distort it again. So I think we should be really careful as a clinician scientist when we think, I don't think we should put value judgments on worse or not worse, but maybe just different. So maybe imagery brings some benefits, but it brings some costs. Sometimes it's nice to distort memories, sometimes it's not a good idea. And perhaps in something like eyewitness there's an other side, which is you might be more reliable witness if your imagination isn't distorting the event over a 20-year period. So I think maybe asking, I'm a bit of a pedant for questions. The hardest thing is to ask the right questions. And that's why meetings like this help. And I was kind of scribbling down your questions, and I'd love to think more.
It's the lady with the green top. Yes. With the black hair and the green top. Do you have a question?
So I'm a little bit confused about hyperphantasia in that I don't. What makes it significantly different from having just a very good visual imagination?
So I'm wondering about hyperphantasia and what the metric is other than just a particularly significant or vivid visual imagination. Is there something that measures it beyond like our subjective descriptions of how good our imagination is, if that makes sense?
So at the moment,
Repeat the question because the microphone's not working.
Oh, is it? Was it not?
You speak directly into it. I'll just turn the volume a bit.
Okay. So the question was, what is there to hyperphantasia beyond having a vivid visual imagination? And I think the answer is that's what it means. So the point of departure is scoring high on a vividness of visual imagery questionnaire, and then the skeptical question would be, does that mean anything? Because how can you judge your own imagery? And my response to that would be, well, I think there probably is something going on here for all sorts of reasons, but it would be nice to have some more objective measures, which might involve brain imaging or might involve neuropsychological tests, the kind of things that Joel was talking about yesterday. So I think there's a gradual process by which we find out how people describe their experience and then validate that in a variety of ways.
Follows on like a fun activity you could maybe do at the next conference, so hopefully you have a lunchtime discussion, but the idea of like virtual reality masks where hyperphantasic and regular phantasic artists or people could make a simulation of what their internal experience is like, or maybe for hyperphantasics the visual experience that they project into the world, that then everyone else can kind of step into their brains, maybe?
Fiona might have something interesting to say about it, because you're interested in virtual reality.
I'm interested in virtual reality. So, one thing is augmented reality. So, a lot of people have tried virtual reality, but not a lot of people have tried augmented reality. Some of that technology is very limited because it limits you to a small portion of your visual field. But when you use augmented reality, you can see the world around you, and then you see an object placed within that world. And the object is sometimes transparent, sometimes it's not. My question would be, though, whether you can ever really create imagination experiences by using perception. So my talk tomorrow is really about looking at unusual forms of perception and how close they come to being like imagery. And I think some of the examples I have are probably better than you could do with augmented reality or with virtual reality. So, but it's a nice idea. I like the general thought of that.
It would be hard for the computer person to work with the person to make it, unless the computer tech person was creating their own internal visual experience, that would be perhaps the easiest.
And they also have to be good at what they're doing.
Yes.
Because you can't necessarily translate things easily.
Yes, yeah.
Red top here.
So, when I have hyperphantasic, it's not just visual, it is multisensory. I don't think you can reproduce that through virtual reality. However, is it possible to do research into the brain function when so many different senses are involved?
I mean, there's lots of work that's done on multimodal perception, and some people are starting to think a little bit about multisensory imagination. I think certainly in the group that I talked about this morning, they were very keen to think about whether people who have aphantasia or hyperphantasia have it in senses other than vision, and that's something I'm really interested in. And also whether you can have genuinely multimodal imagery. So can you imagine not just seeing someone and not just hearing someone, but experiencing the very person that you're seeing talking as if the sound is coming from them? And I don't see why you can't. I mean, I'm not hyperphantasic. I think I have mid-range, but I think I can imagine that.
You'd feel their touch, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yep.
One thing I'm curious about, if we've had people that have become aphantasic later in life and not born with it, if they have SDAM as well, do they lose that ability to have episodic memories? Or is that something that's not been asked yet?
So there is something that's been called visual memory deficit amnesia. So there are people who lose vision and appear or lose aspects of vision and seem to lose important elements of autobiographical memory as well. So I think the answer is probably yes.
So if someone's had aphantasia all their life, or not, sorry, if someone's developed it, and I'm saying, could they then develop SDAM as well, or is it completely not connected?
Do you want to say what SDAM is?
It's
severely deficient autobiographical memory.
Yeah. So has anyone developed that because they've become aphantasia?
Yes. So that's really what I'm saying. So there are examples of a acquired amnesia due to visual loss. So that's described.
So a question to Joel. In your speaking, I get a conflation between visual imagery and imagery. When you're asking about, for instance, whether I can remember something a second or 2 seconds afterwards, if you're talking about visual imagery, I can't. If you're talking about auditory imagery, I can image those words, but I can't image pictures. And I get a sense from you that you're tending to conflate visual imagery and imagery.
Are you talking about the memory stuff I was just talking about then? Okay, so when I'm talking about memory, I'm not talking about any kind of imagery. I'm just talking about memory. So the way people study memory typically is based on performance. So how much of these things can you remember over this amount of time? It doesn't matter how you remember it, what you're doing, what strategy you use, what brain areas, doesn't matter. And so you got to look a little bit more deeply. You find that some people who have imagery will be using it to help their performance in this memory task, while other people will be using different strategies. They'll be rehearsing the shapes or the orientations or using geometry or spatial algorithms or all these different kinds of things. So you need to scratch a little bit under the surface. So there I was talking about the way memory is typically studied, which is by some X performance, a criteria, and how much information can you hold over time, basically, independent of how you hold that or what format it's held in. Does that help? Does that answer the question? Yeah. Okay.
Some of the research, Joel, that you were talking about yesterday reminded me of cognitive bias, the priming function of visual imagery. So I wondered if there had been any studies into the relationship of aphantasia and perhaps less cognitive bias. To what extent does cognitive bias depend on having visual imagery? Would aphantasias be, more neutral, less partisan citizens, or do we just make up for it with semantics and words and other ways?
So what kind of cognitive bias are you referring to? There's so many different...
There are so many different...
I mean, so it's a...
Very general idea. Well, I guess just that what you believe to be true. When you hear something, you will remember and hear the information that corresponds to your preconceived ideas. I guess is what I mean. So if you imagine, if you have an image about the way something should be, if you have a belief that's based on a visual image, is that going to be stronger than other kinds of beliefs?
Oh, specifically around beliefs?
Well, again,
Yeah.
that's what I think that is what a lot of cognitive bias is based on, isn't it? Belief?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've done some. We did some lab experiments on cognitive biases and imagery, which were around things like biases and how we interpret ambiguous stimuli. Exactly like you say, we impose beliefs on things. And we didn't work with people with different underlying abilities. What we did instead was encourage one group of people to use imagery more and one group of people to use imagery less, or to use verbal more. And we found it was easier to push people's biases around when they used imagery, in line with your hypothesis. So if we train people to be what we would call a positive interpretation bias about the world, we could do that more strongly with imagery, but we could also train a negative interpretation bias more strongly with imagery. So it just sort of amplified that bias process.
With memory, there's two different types of memory. Is that just because there's events and interactions and things like that, memories of people and what happens? And memory about learning, because learning, I can do the learning part, but I've got no memories of anything past yesterday, really. So anything that happens, I don't remember it. But if I'm learning something, I remember it.
What kind of things? Are you talking about like actions, like or like playing a musical instrument or riding a bike, learning that kind of learning, or?
That's a cerebellum learning. That's only just learning facts and figures and science and how to do technical things. That's easy, I can do that. But remembering what happened yesterday or the day before yesterday or whatever.
Oh, okay, so more of that episodes in your life or episodic memory. Yeah.
Actions with people, basically those things. Don't remember any of those. So it's just, I can do the learning part, but just everything else disappears. And I just wondered if that was a totally separate mechanism, or it's because it's a psychological block in any interaction with people.
Well, I think the way, so it's sort of, when we people talk about SDAM or the severely deficient autobiographical, so it's normally referring to these interactions you've had, or experiences of episodes in your life that you've had, and they separate that out from knowledge about the country we're in, or what or the weather, like those kind of facts or semantics are normally separated from that, in a similar way to like riding a bike or skiing would be separated from that as well.
There's no against it, it's just everything that happens.
I think, can we just talk directly into the mic like that? I think we can pick up better.
Like that.
Yeah.
Just taking a step back, there's a kind of very, very basic distinction in memory research between knowledge for facts and knowledge for personal episodes, so sometimes called semantic memory and episodic memory. And there do seem to be people who have pretty good semantic memory, pretty good memory for facts, but really I've found it very hard to evoke a rich autobiographical memory, to remember what it was like to be there. So there's a condition called developmental amnesia, children who have damage to the hippocampus early in life. This was only picked up quite recently, but they can do quite well at school because they can learn facts okay, but they can't really tell you what they did yesterday. So that dissociation does exist in memory research, and it may well be that aphantasia, in some cases, I think aphantasia is a mixed feast, but in some cases plays into that. And I think that certainly from the folk who've been in touch with us, there seem to be some people with aphantasia who are like that, in that they have pretty good memory for facts, sometimes very good memory for facts, but can't easily re-experience events from the past, because that, in their case, seems to require access to imagery which they don't have. That would be interesting to know for how many people in this audience that's true. Maybe that's not the right moment to ask, but I know from conversations I've had so far that it's true for some, but I think not for all. So I think there's variability within aphantasia.
Can I just pick up on the SDAM thing, because just one thing is the initial study was 3 people, but it did involve scanning. So there's already a database in that original paper. Okay. The second point is it was lifelong rather than acquired. So it was, and they did go, as far as they were concerned, it wasn't equivalent to developmental. So as you know, of course, but that is an interesting point. The third thing I want to ask the neuroscientists present is, they're already network-based studies. They've jumped off from that research into network-based papers, and a few of those have started to appear. Have they been of any use to you in your area of work yet?
Just to clarify, when you say network, do you mean the network inside the brain networks? Those particular papers, not that much, but that is a general trend we're seeing as there's this shift of brain research going from sort of neuroscience psychologists into more computer scientist realm, where there's these real deep learning algorithms being thrown at the data. So people are now looking. Sorry? Sure, yeah. So that is a general trend we see across most areas in neuroscience, that people are looking at these complex, 3 or even 4-dimensional networks and how they operate, and looking at dimensions of those rather than single areas or anything like that. So it's telling us a lot more about brain function, but it's harder to intuitively understand as humans here.
I was under the mistaken impression that the right brain was responsible for visual and creativity and stuff like that, and all lateral. And the left brain, like language and in linear. But obviously that's not the case. What is the right brain doing?
I mean, so that's kind of a thing. So there's lateralization in certain tasks, right? But that doesn't mean what you just said, and so it's one of those things which gets amplified, I think, from journalist to journalist, and then people start to sort of remember. It's like the 10% of you only use 10% of your brain kind of thing. It's these things which get amplified through the media and end up as this sort of cartoon version. But there are certain tasks, like in lots of imagery tasks, we see lateralization, so more activity on one side than the other. But it doesn't mean that imagery is only happening in one side of the brain. Not at all. No.
Is language on the left as well, with the vision predominantly?
I think there's some more lateralization on the left, isn't that right? Yeah, I think,
yes,
but it depends.
So tell me if you think I'm wrong. I think language, we're pretty clear about. Language is more left than right. At least the kind of basics of language are more left than right. Face recognition, more right than left. So you're more likely to have trouble recognizing faces if you knock out your right.
All right, yeah.
Face recognition area than your left. And probably the left hemisphere is biased towards more focal detail perception, and the right more global holistic.
A little bit, I think, but it's remember the whole brain's talking to itself all the time. It's very hard to isolate activity in the brain. If you look at sort of close to real-time activities then you just see this bouncing around in very complex network ways all the time.
Language is probably the only faculty which absolutely everyone agrees about. If you have a stroke in your left hemisphere, you're much more likely to become dysphasic than if you have a stroke in your right one.
Another thing to really remember with these studies is that they're all done on right-handed people. So what you find is that language ability tends to be less lateral in left-handed people than right-handed people. So people who are left-handed are less likely to lose their language ability if they have a stroke, simply because it seems like more areas of the brain can be preserved that are using or dealing with language. So that's really important to note as well.
Worth asking how many people are left or right-handed.
Yeah.
While we're on the theme, and because Emily is here, there is a kind of broad generalisation that the right hemisphere has a bit more to do with emotion than the left. Would you agree?
The first book I ever read was about that, actually. It drew me into psychology, but I'm not quite sure, to be completely honest. I think it's a good question. Yeah. I'm not very serious, actually.
I think a more useful way to think about it is the top brain, bottom brain. Like this is very clear trend as you go from the sort of before the cortex to the first layers of the cortex through. Sort of, if you think of, and I'm generalizing here, but activity flows in one direction, but it's always flowing in multiple directions. But the change in complexity we see as you move in one direction through the brain, I think, is perhaps a more interesting question to ask and way to think about neural processing.
Could I just ask Adam? So, in line with one of the questions here, do you know if there's a correlation between handedness and being aphantasic or hyperphantasic? And can we ask the audience for a show of left-handed people and right-handed people?
I don't know. You're welcome to ask.
Okay, so could we have a hands up if you're right-handed? Okay. And a hands up if you're left-handed. That kind of looks about right. That looks about standard that you would find in the population. Oh, ambidextrous. Anyone ambidextrous? Oh, the two-handed person. Okay. Look, I mean, as best as you can tell, that would be what you would sort of predict, I think. I think the straw polls can only go so far. I mean, okay, so for hyperphantasics, if you're hyperphantasic, put up your hand. And then keep it up if you're left-handed. Yeah, what you would expect. Yeah.
What about ambidextrous?
There's two of you. Three.
So I think as we just sort of ruminating on this theme, as we I think what's happening here is we're looking for simplifications. We're looking at ways that we can make sense out of something that seems very complex. And I guess the challenge is that we need to make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I think one of the things that often we're in danger of is looking at variables simply because they're available, not because they are explanatorily possible or plausible even. So, the classic example of this is gender differences or sex differences. Everyone who ever gets a data set says, well, I wonder if there's a difference between the male and female people. Almost never was there an a priori reason to think that was an interesting variable. It's just a thing you can now do because you've got data, and then you add to the noise on that rather unhelpful debate. A debate which has been resolved and yet keeps reappearing like the 10% of the brain or the extreme lateralization. So I think what I'm saying is at this early stage in our journey into what is visual imagery and how is it different between us, we need to keep pursuing the simple but not leap to too simple. But off we go.
Yeah, so I was wondering if there is, if you saw any correlation between hyperphantasia and aphantasia and empathy maybe, because empathy could be a sort of simulation, right?
Can you hear that at the back?
No.
Correlation between hyperphantasia and aphantasia and empathy.
Yeah. Does anyone know if it's been studied?
It hasn't really systematically been studied. I think there is, there seems to be some interesting relationship between autistic spectrum disorder and variations in visual imagery. And in the room in which I was, there were two people with autistic spectrum disorder who were both hyperphantasic, which is the opposite of what I had expected, because if anything, I think there is probably some loose association between aphantasia and autistic spectrum disorder. Of course, the capacity for imagination has always been regarded as an important element in ASD, and there's a link between ASD and empathy. So I think there probably are connections here, but it's far too early to be sure what they are, though Emily may know.
I don't know, but I think it's a really useful question, because I guess it's a little bit related to your point about trying to think what the right questions to ask are. And because there's perhaps an assumption, maybe people who have a label of autism may be less good at imagery, that they don't have imagery that maybe is problematic for them. And we showed in a very simple study that if you actually ask questions so people can understand in children with a diagnosis of autism what imagery was like, they would often not use it generally, but when they were super anxious it would pop into their head. And of course, if that was very, very distressing. So I guess when we use the term imagery, it's also and when, and what's the consequence of that. And if it's not a huge part of your landscape all the time and it does happen, how does that feel? So yeah, let's keep asking questions and going a little bit further with the function as well.
Just quickly, there's one study I can think of which shows that how visually you think, and they kind of call it imagery, whether it's exactly imagery or not, is related to how you answer moral dilemmas. So these are kind of moral dilemma questions where you've got to push someone off, you've got to touch someone and push them off the bridge to stop the train cart to save the 5 people's lives. So the idea from this data was that people with stronger imagery are less likely to push the person off because they feel for that person they're pushing. And so this idea of you get asked a question, you run the simulation, and you're less likely to make a utilitarian judgment because you don't want to when you imagine pushing the person, it makes you feel bad about pushing the person, therefore it nudges your behavior in that way.
You mentioned autism, and that reminded me. I'm dyslexic, and I was introduced to visual imagery by Tom West from America, who wrote the book In the Mind's Eye. That was early 1990s. I met with him, and it was a great release to discover visual imagery, because that was my world. I'm autodidactic because I left school with nothing, and it made sense of me, helped my wife understand me. His book, In the Mind's Eye, Visual Thinkers, Gifted People with Dyslexic and Other Learning Difficulties. And I wondered if any of you were familiar with that work.
Must look it up.
There was a really brilliant exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery a few years ago by an artist called Abigail Reynolds, and it was all about advantage of dyslexia and imagery and all the things that people could do and linking to creativity. So I don't know this particular book, but I think it's a theme that's cropped up in the visual arts in a variety of ways. And we just need loads of different... It's brilliant that there are lots of different ways of solving problems and solving the world. And she invented this fantastic card pack of games that if you had dyslexia and were good at imagery, you were just much better at. And it's really fun.
So to clarify, you're hyperphantasic and dyslexic?
Yes, that's right. Yes. And that's my world. That's...
Yeah.
Yeah, I see things.
The man.
I'm sorry you said the man, but...
What's normal as far as multisensory, both memory and then imagination? Like, is it normal for most people to be able to have multisensory memory replay in their mind? And then same thing with imagination. Is that normal?
Did anybody hear that question?
Well, again, we don't. Maybe let's use the word average or like the mean or something rather than normal.
Mean sounds mean.
Mean sounds mean. Well, so it depends what the question. Yeah, I don't know, that's not. Yeah. So if you have to do which part of the spectrum do most people fit in? Is that kind of what you're asking? The bell curve. Yeah. So in terms of where do most people fall on the VVIQ? What number would you give them? What is it? 59.
That's not multisensory.
That's not multisensory, right?
So it would be something like the Plymouth.
Oh, okay. Do you know? I don't know how to quantify that in numbers, or I can't remember the. No, I can't remember. Do you know?
No, but there's people studying this around the corner at the University of Plymouth, so we should something else to be looked at.
Mm.
So I know a little bit about smell and taste imagery, and for me those are quite interesting because I would say there are more people who report having no smell and taste imagery than report having no visual imagery, and I think there's just been very little work done on multimodal imagery, full stop.
Two things. One, just very briefly to say that I think that it's different to make a distinction between a person who has no imagery and a whole spectrum going on to very vivid imagery, than to make a distinction between the no imagery and the vivid imagery. Do you see what I mean? The complete absence of something. So I just wanted to say that. But the question I wanted to ask was about consciousness. I think, would you not expect the neural correlates of conscious experience, like visual imagery, to be different from the neural concepts, neural correlates of an unconscious experience, which is the experience that underlies the conscious one? So if you're not having a conscious experience, it's not really surprising that certain neural correlates are not there. But the stuff of which the conscious experience is made could still be there in us as well as a fantastic people.
So yeah, absolutely, I agree. So that's why we did that experiment I described yesterday, where we wanted to, even though people were saying, no, I don't have imagery, we tested them using that binocular rivalry method, because if we did see the priming, the bias there, it would suggest that there's visual representations there, even though people were not aware of them. And that wasn't the result we found. We found that there was no priming and no bias. But in other situations, in people with imagery, we have now evidence of representations that we can call unconscious, that are like imagery, unconscious imagery that is there and does also bias perception in a very similar way. And people are claiming that those thoughts are not there, even though we can detect them and decode them and do things like that. So slightly different, but yeah, similar kind of idea, yeah.
Can I just add just adding a rider, there is a sense in which the visual information is there, isn't there? Because people with aphantasia are often absolutely fine at recognizing faces and distinguishing between them. So that tells you that that some kind of representation is there, not necessarily in the working memory case, but there has to be at some level a representation which is indeed not accessible to consciousness. So in that sense, aphantasia is a disorder of visual consciousness, would you say?
What's the question about? So you can tell the difference between two different things. Doesn't mean it's a visual representation that's responsible for that performance in a task. Could be all kinds of things, and so we don't know the answer to that yet, I think.
Even if they're two visual things?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So they could be symbolic representations. They could be propositional. They could be some kind of tactile representation. You could use. There's many different ways you could tell two things apart like that. They wouldn't rely on facial representations in the fusiform face area, for example. Is that what? That's what you're asking, right? Yeah.
Visually tell two faces apart.
Do you mean perceptually, or with imagery, or in the mind, or yeah?
And you have, in some sense, to have representations of those two things you're telling apart.
I do that verbally. I just got my facial recognition is like a Guess Who game. I find it difficult when I get to know people if they look similar. So I learn the people that are distinctive first, and I know them by what's different to other people. And I recognise people, but not when they're out of context. Because I know in my workplace that's going to be that person, not the other people.
So, let me give I think my example is not a good one. If somebody who's aphantasic can recognise somebody, so somebody who
you're looking, yeah,
and says that's Joel, doesn't that mean they have a Joel visual representation?
So they're visually, the information's coming in through the retina and it's being processed in a bottom-up kind of fashion.
They're matching what they're seeing to their visual representation.
Yeah, would suggest that there is, yeah.
So that's the sense in which I felt.
Doesn't mean that would be the same representation that if you have imagery you would use as imagery. And so you could have that with or without the imagery representation or some other symbolic representation or something else, yeah.
Can I follow up on this question here?
Does it follow?
Sorry, but I do dream in imagery. When I first wake, but I'm still very asleep. I remember the dream, I can see the imagery and the whole thing. But as I get more awake, I seem to disappear. And by the time I'm fully awake, I can't remember anything other than the fact I did dream. And I've always assumed it's the fact that my subconscious brain is, as usual, not telling me very much. And therefore it's gone to my conscious memory, but it's going to be somewhere.
I think we have a big lecture. Yeah, and I have a very similar challenge to that, because for those of us who can see in our dreams, we see those images, and those are real images, and a lot of them match up to real life. So if I don't have that image somewhere in my brain, how does my brain generate that in my dream? So I feel like there has to be an image in my brain somewhere. I just can't consciously get to.
Sure, yeah.
So I feel like that's different than what you've been saying. I feel like you've been saying there is no image anywhere in the brain.
No, I didn't say anywhere. No. So we know the information. There's information like that in the brain. We know that, if you dream, it's the kind of images or the kind of representations, and if they're happening voluntarily or they're happening involuntarily, like when you're dreaming, we know that those kinds of situations probably activate in different areas, slightly different areas and different layers in visual cortex.